My name is Jo McGowan. I'm Head of Public Affairs at the Centre for Ageing Better. As you all know, we're building an age-friendly social movement to change the way people think, feel and act when it comes to ageing. And in autumn this year, we will launch a public-facing campaign that aims to shift ageist attitudes. As part of this, we're doing a series of live stream interviews with influential people who have done inspiring work to challenge ageism and help create the culture shift around ageing that's so sorely needed. I'm delighted to be joined by none other than the incredible author and activist, Ashton Applewhite. She's a recognised expert on ageism and author of This Chair Rocks, a manifesto against ageism. Her work has been covered by several national newspapers in the UK and in the US, and she's spoken widely, including delivering a talk on the TED main stage and at the United Nations. She really is the leading spokesperson for how we can work to challenge ageism, and I'm really excited to be able to speak to her about these issues today. So, Ashton, can you start by telling us how you became part of the movement to challenge ageism? Was there a specific moment or a deciding factor which helped you to choose to campaign on this issue?
I wouldn't say there was a meet cute moment. I just was probably looking in the mirror, as we do, and realized that this getting older thing was happening to me. I was in my mid-50s, so that was 15 years ago. And, I think it's hard to imagine getting older. I don't think that's ageism. I think we age slowly, and as a kid, you can't imagine you'll ever stop running around and prefer sitting, right? But I realized I was sort of vaguely, generally very apprehensive about it. So being a nerdy person, I started learning about longevity. I started interviewing people over 80 and just reading, researching stuff that was right at the top of the internet, and realized in a matter of, it feels like weeks, certainly months, just a few months, how inaccurate my understanding, my assumptions about the years ahead were, how way off base, not nuanced enough, way too negative. So I became obsessed with why we only hear the negative. There are all kinds of legitimate reasons to be apprehensive, but we never hear the other side of the story. So that's what I decided to devote myself to, because it seems so damaging and so harmful that our fears are so out of proportion to reality.
That's so interesting. And in the time that you've been working on it, so you said about 15 years now, do you think kind of public understanding of ageist attitudes or aging has shifted at all?
I do.
That's fantastic.
I do. I mean, I don't usually have to define the word, although I will define the word because it never hurts. Ageism, the dictionary definition is discrimination and stereotyping on the basis of age. We are all ageist. We're all biased because we live in a culture that barrages us with messages from starting with Disney movies and children's books, right? Attitudes start to form in early childhood, but we learn it, right? Children are not born biased. And unless we stop to unlearn them, they become part of our identities. That's internalized bias. And so I do see not only that more people know what the word is, but are acknowledging it. I mean, and I see much more awareness of it, thanks in part to the good work that the Center for Aging Better is doing. I started a website with two colleagues called the Old School Anti-Ageism Clearinghouse in 2018, and we basically, scraped the internet for everything we could find, which was less than 100 things, and now it's several hundred, fantastic resources of all sorts, all free except the books, oldschool.info. So I see from the people, the amount of resources that are coming our way. I see it in how often ageism is now part of conversations. I see it in more headlines, so I know it's just not just me looking for what I want to see, right? I mean, even at the moment, all the conversation around the presidential candidates being too old for office, and I will say that to say someone, calling someone out on the basis of their age as unqualified for office is no more acceptable than on the basis of gender or race or body size or anything else, period. But even the most ageist comments about it acknowledge that they are ageist, that concept is part of even the most biased discourse, and that is real progress.
So you think increased awareness of ageism, but not necessarily kind of more accurate or more positive views of aging kind of in the culture and the media?
I don't think you can separate those two. I think if people acknowledge a bias, That's huge. We can't challenge bias unless we're aware of it, right? And most bias is unconscious. So the fact that people are aware that their attitudes are betraying a bias is huge progress.
That's really interesting. And in terms of our kind of endpoint, what do you think the biggest societal change or singular moment would be that would signal to you that the battle against ageism is being won and it is a real big step forward?
You know, I think to speak in terms of winning or losing is, as you know, a false binary. Because all forms of bias are intersect and inform and compound each other. We know that from this idea of intersectionality. And one of the reasons I'm optimistic about the work that I do is that I think the notion of that, an understanding of the intersectional nature of all these different forms of bias and oppression, is much more common knowledge. You know, it was an idea that I didn't encounter until I started to do this work in my 50s, right? So I think that the ground has been plowed in a way. We are not starting from zero with, you know, when the women's movement, the mainstream women's movement got started in the 1970s, 60s and 70s, that it was a reach to think that women could run a Fortune 500 company or really be equal partners in so many other things. That's not a reach anymore. And look at the progress we've made on other forms of discrimination. So we are not starting from zero. And the flip side of that is, we cannot undo ageism without undoing ableism, which is discrimination and prejudice against people with disabilities, because a lot of what we assume is ageism, our apprehension about getting older, is actually about how our minds and bodies might change, and that's not about age. Yeah. Right? Plenty of younger people have disabilities, plenty of older people escape it. So ableism underlies so much age stigma and shame. Obviously, we're not going to undo ageism without gender equity, because aging is harder for women, and women are doubly discriminated against by the intersection of ageism and sexism. And we are not going to undo ageism without racial equity, because racism denies to so many people around the world, black and brown people, the opportunity to age at all. So when are we going to end it all? And is it all going to be, rainbows and unicorns and equity for everybody? That's a long way off. But any progress we make against any of those things undermines it all. Advocacy is intersectional too. And I see all the progress we're making in awareness. And also, let's face it, we're getting a lot of pushback. You only get pushback when you're getting somewhere, right? No one gives up power without a struggle. So in a sense, that is a sign too that we are really starting to challenge a whole bunch of existing power structures.
Do you think there's a difference to kind of the way these narratives are in the UK and the US, or is there actually a lot of kind of commonality in terms of ageist attitudes?
I live in New York, and I always think it's better anywhere than in the United States, which is the epicenter of youth culture and also the most hyper-capitalist country in the world. And what capitalism does is frame aging as a problem to be solved, or physical changes as diseases that need to be cured because no one makes money off satisfaction, right? And so I do think a lot of those messages come from the United States, but as we know, in our hyper-connected world, they travel all over the place. So I'm thrilled that the UK is launching an anti-ageism campaign. My evidence for the fact that a global movement to end ageism is underway is the fact that when we launched the Old School Clearinghouse, we didn't have a campaign section. And now there are over 40 campaigns from around the world, not to help you live forever or touch your toes, but actually to educate people about what ageism is, what it walks like, what it quacks like, and what we can do to undo it between our ears. And of course, your campaign is the next one up. So that's really exciting, and that is quantifiable evidence. Where it's different, Australia was the first national campaign, but they've popped up all over the place.
And what do you think is the biggest challenge in getting people to appreciate how serious ageism is and the biggest kind of barrier to overcome? Is it that internalized ageism, or?
I think so. I mean, I think that, ageism takes root in each of us in denial. Our reluctance to identify as older, or even, God forbid, old, even though everyone is aging. Aging is not something sad and icky that old people do. It is, you are aging. You're aging every day. Every day you wake up a day older, just like me. And it is ironically our reluctance to identify as, to make a connection. I have a thing in my book, a phrase I appropriated from a geriatrician named Joanne Lynn, who calls herself an old person in training. And I learned it long ago. And I didn't know how important it would be to me, but I'm like, oh, I guess that's what I have become. And it is simply a trick, if you will, to acknowledge that someday, if you're lucky, you will get old. And that future older you can be as far down the road as you need her to be. She can be a blink on the horizon, a dot. But simply to acknowledge that someday you will be her, you will converge, helps break that habit of like, I don't want to think about it, it's sad and icky and depressing, and helps us look at the older people around us instead of past them, and look at behaviors or attitudes that seem enviable or admirable, and also behaviors you don't like. How do you want to be? Because the minute you look at something, instead of, the dragon under the bed when you're a child, whatever we don't look at is invariably more terrible than the thing we examine. And the fact is, there are, hard things about getting older, but fewer than we think. Some part of your body is going to fall apart. Cognitive decline is not inevitable, but, physical decline of some system, but it's not like the whole system falls apart, right? Not all the things happen to all the people, and we age at different rates. Socially, physically, cognitively, it's different for each of us. And the longer we live, the more different from each of us we become, which is why it's so absurd. It's absurd to stereotype any group. It is especially absurd to stereotype older people because diversity, heterogeneity is the defining characteristic of later life, right? So it doesn't make sense to put anyone in a bucket. So the older the person, the less their chronological age says about them. And just knowing these things, there's tons of data now, fascinating research about how attitudes towards aging affect how our minds and bodies function. And they're usually framed with people with more positive attitudes, live longer, walk quicker, are less likely to develop Alzheimer's even if they have the gene that predisposes them to the disease. I don't like to say positive attitudes because it sounds like you're, covering over the difficult things of, ending up alone, running out of money. Those are legitimate fears, especially in a merciless capitalist system, which we all live in. But just educating yourself. Education is free. Everything in old school is free except the books. There's so much about aging that we cannot control, right? No matter, even if you're really rich and really white and have a ton of people to help you age, quote unquote, successfully, one of my least favorite phrases, you are still subject to all sorts of forces beyond your control, especially, luck. One thing we can control is our attitudes. By learning more about what aging actually involves, by looking at the older people around us and thinking, hey, they're enjoying their lives, they're doing meaningful things, and that could be for me too.
That's so interesting. And what is one thing that somebody listening to this can do to tackle ageism or kind of ageist attitudes?
Well, it's different for each of us, so I sound like I'm advertising Old School, but I make no money off it. Oldschool.info, one place to go for everything about ageism, so noodle around and see what appeals to you. There's animations, there's books, there's videos, there's whatever. I would say one thing you could do is work to break the habit of heading for people your own age when you come in the room, which we all do, no judgment, and I think, age says so little, so much less than we think it does about what we're interested in or what we're capable of, right? And I think we all think, oh, those young people, their face will fall if, I go and talk to them. or we make the assumption we wouldn't have anything in common. Well, yes, there are those few people who are so biased that indeed they won't even try, but most people are not jerks, and you will find that you have something in common or to talk about, or you don't, but it won't be because of the age gap, right? So try that, and at work, at play, anywhere. And another thing is to think about the words old and young and how you use them. Because in an ageist society, we tend to use old as a, placeholder for insert negative thing. And young, I feel young. I don't feel old. Mm-hmm. What that really means is I don't feel invisible. I don't feel sexless. I don't feel incompetent. And I felt all those things, honestly, worse when I was an adolescent than I have ever felt since. So think literally about how you use those words and use the actual feeling, because there is no way to feel old. Mm-hmm. Old is different for me than it is for someone else who is 71, right? There's no way to feel old, because it's utterly individual, just like almost everything else in life.
It's very oppositional, isn't it? Old and young.
Yeah.
It's like really othering.
It's a false binary. People are always saying, when does old begin? And I just saw New York City is initiating an anti-ageism curriculum for 8 high schools in New York. They're going to put it on Old School where you can find it. And the Wall Street Journal did a study, which had the whole headline of, when does old begin, which I'm a little sick of, because it posits this sort of line in the sand and you step over it and then everything falls apart. And one of the teenage students in the program said she, quote unquote, felt old because her 6-year-old sister and her friends knew songs on TikTok that she didn't know. And that's the point. We age in relation to others, always. We don't wake up old. Someone who's 88 in a retirement home will assure you that she is younger than Mrs. McGillicuddy down the hall. The reason that's important to her is because of her own internalized ageism. She is clinging to the idea that being younger equals better. So, older people are as ageist as anyone else, possibly more so because we've had a lifetime of being brainwashed by this culture. But the minute you stop to look at it and look at your own attitudes towards age and aging, that's the first fundamental part, and to realize oh crap, all these ideas have taken up root inside my head, and that is uncomfortable. But the next step happens automatically. It's like letting a genie out of a bottle. You see it, then you start to see it. It's like breaking a spell. You start to see it in the culture around you, in advertising, on television, in the things people, your friends and strangers, unwittingly say. And you're like, oh, it's all around us. And that means that we can come together and do something about it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for your time, Ashton. It's fantastic to hear all about the great work that you're doing with Old School Clearinghouse. And really excited to work with you as we develop the ageism campaign. You can follow Ashton Applewhite on her LinkedIn page, visit her website, thischairrocks.com, and keep up to date with the important and influential work that she does. Thank you to everyone for listening, and please join us for our next social media live. Details to come soon. Thanks again, Ashton.